Are you sabotaging your own success without even realizing it? Think about it for a moment. Have you ever been on the verge of something great, only to watch yourself pull back at the last second? Maybe you procrastinated on that important project until the deadline passed. Perhaps you pushed away someone who genuinely cared about you, right when the relationship was getting serious. Or maybe you stayed silent when you had the perfect opportunity to speak up and change your situation. It's frustrating, isn't it? You set goals, you make plans, you know exactly what you want, and yet something inside you seems determined to prevent you from getting there. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, spent decades exploring this puzzling phenomenon. He discovered something profound, something that might explain why you keep repeating the same self-destructive patterns over and over again. Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Today, we're going deep into Jung's revolutionary psychology to uncover the 7 hidden signs that your own mind is working against you. These aren't just abstract concepts. These are real patterns that show up in everyday life, quietly steering you away from the person you're meant to become. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand not just why you self-sabotage, but more importantly, how to stop doing it. So let's begin this journey into the hidden parts of yourself. Self-sabotage is one of the most perplexing aspects of human behavior. It's when we actively work against our own best interests, undermining our goals, our relationships, and our potential for happiness. And here's what makes it so disturbing. We usually don't even realize we're doing it. Think about the last time you had a goal that really mattered to you. Maybe it was getting in shape, starting a business, asking someone out, or finally finishing that creative project you've been putting off for years. You started with enthusiasm, didn't you? You could feel the excitement, the possibility, the vision of who you'd become once you achieved it. But then something happened. Maybe you got busy with other things. Maybe you suddenly remembered all the reasons it wouldn't work. Maybe you convinced yourself it wasn't the right time, that you needed to wait just a little longer, prepare just a bit more, and before you knew it, weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and that dream quietly faded into the background of your life. This isn't laziness. This isn't lack of willpower. This is something far more complex, something that operates beneath the surface of your conscious awareness. Carl Jung dedicated much of his life's work to understanding the hidden forces within the human psyche. He discovered that our minds aren't simple, unified entities making rational decisions. Instead, we're composed of multiple layers, multiple voices, multiple competing desires and fears. And many of these exist in what Jung called the unconscious, a vast realm of our psyche that influences our behavior without us ever knowing it's there. Here's where it gets really interesting. Jung observed that when we reject certain parts of ourselves, when we push down emotions we don't want to feel, traits we don't want to have, or desires we're afraid to acknowledge, those rejected parts don't just disappear. They don't evaporate into nothing. Instead, they sink into the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is the repository of everything about ourselves that we've denied, repressed, or never allowed to develop. And here's the crucial part. The shadow doesn't remain passive. It's not just sitting quietly in some dark corner of your mind. No, it's active, it's powerful, and it's constantly influencing your behavior in ways you can't see. Think of it like this. Imagine you're steering a ship, consciously navigating toward your destination. You're looking at your map, adjusting your course, making what you think are rational decisions. But what you don't realize is that there's a powerful current beneath the surface, pushing you in a completely different direction. That current is your shadow. And until you become aware of it, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to direct your life while you wonder why you keep ending up in places you never intended to go. So the question becomes, why would any part of us deliberately undermine our conscious goals? What could possibly be the purpose of self-sabotage? Jung's answer might surprise you. The shadow isn't trying to destroy you. In fact, in its own twisted way, it's trying to protect you. Those rejected parts of yourself, those suppressed emotions and hidden fears, they formed in response to real experiences, often from childhood. Maybe you learned that being vulnerable led to pain, so you developed defenses against intimacy. Maybe you were punished for expressing anger, so you pushed that emotion deep down where it now erupts in unexpected ways. Maybe you were told that your dreams were unrealistic, so you learned to abandon them before they could disappoint you. The shadow operates on outdated programming, ancient survival mechanisms that once served a purpose, but now hold you back. And this is why self-sabotage is so difficult to overcome. You're not just fighting bad habits or lack of discipline. You're fighting parts of yourself that genuinely believe they're keeping you safe, even as they prevent you from living the life you truly want. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to explore 7 specific signs that your shadow is active, 7 ways that self-sabotage shows up in everyday life. More importantly, we're going to understand what Jung discovered about how to work with these hidden parts of yourself, how to integrate the shadow rather than fight it, and how to finally break free from the patterns that have been holding you back. This isn't just theory. This is practical wisdom that can change your life if you're willing to look honestly at the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. So let's dive into the first sign. The first sign that your shadow is active, that you're engaging in self-sabotage, is perhaps the most obvious yet the most overlooked. You repeat self-destructive patterns, not just once or twice, but over and over again, in different situations, with different people, yet always with the same outcome. It's like watching the same movie play out in your life with different actors, but an identical script. You might recognize this in your relationships. Maybe you always seem to attract the same type of partner, someone emotionally unavailable, someone who doesn't treat you with the respect you deserve. And even though you promise yourself that this time will be different, that you've learned your lesson, somehow you find yourself 6 months later in the exact same situation with a different face. Or perhaps it shows up in your career. You get excited about a new job, a new opportunity, and for the first few weeks or months everything seems perfect. But then something shifts. Maybe you start having conflicts with your boss or co-workers. Maybe you begin to feel undervalued or overlooked. And before you know it, you're updating your resume again, moving on to the next opportunity that will inevitably follow the same trajectory. Jung understood something profound about these patterns. He recognized that they're not random, they're not bad luck, and they're not character flaws that you need to simply overcome through willpower. These patterns exist because there's something unresolved in your unconscious that keeps pulling you back to the same type of situation. Jung called these emotionally charged clusters of memories, thoughts, and feelings complexes. A complex forms when we experience something emotionally significant, but we're unable to process or resolve those emotions at the time. Instead of being integrated into our conscious awareness, these emotions get pushed down into the unconscious, where they remain active, continuing to influence our behavior in ways we can't see. Think of a complex like a gravitational field in your psyche. Just as a planet's gravity pulls objects toward it, a complex pulls you toward certain types of situations, relationships, and behaviors. And the stronger the complex, the more powerful its pull, the more difficult it becomes to break free from the pattern it creates. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine someone, let's call her Sarah, who grew up in a household where love was conditional. Her parents only showed affection when she achieved something, when she made them proud, when she lived up to their expectations. As a child, Sarah couldn't consciously understand or process what was happening. She just knew that to feel loved, she had to perform, to achieve, to be perfect. So she developed a complex around achievement and self-worth. Now, as an adult, Sarah finds herself in a pattern that she can't seem to break. She works constantly, pushing herself to exhaustion, always chasing the next goal, the next achievement. But here's what's fascinating. Whenever she gets close to a major success, whenever she's about to reach a goal that would actually bring her the recognition she craves, something happens. She might start a conflict at work that undermines the project. She might suddenly become sick right before a major presentation. She might make an uncharacteristic mistake that costs her the promotion she was about to receive. From the outside, it looks like bad luck or poor timing. But what's really happening is that Sarah's complex is running the show. Deep in her unconscious, there's a part of her that learned long ago that achievement leads to conditional love, which ultimately feels hollow and unsatisfying. So at the crucial moment, that part sabotages her success to protect her from the disappointment of achieving something, only to discover it doesn't fill the void she's trying to fill. This is the paradox of complexes and self-sabotage. The very patterns that seem to be hurting us are actually trying, in their own misguided way, to protect us from something we fear even more. Sarah isn't sabotaging her success because she doesn't want to succeed. She's sabotaging it because succeeding, and still feeling empty, would confirm her deepest fear that she's fundamentally unlovable unless she's perfect. And since perfection is impossible, that means she's unlovable, period. By sabotaging herself before she reaches the goal, she can maintain the hope that if she just tried harder, if she just achieved more, then she would finally feel the love and acceptance she craves. The pattern, as destructive as it is, serves a psychological function. It protects the ego from a truth it's not ready to face. Jung observed that these patterns often have roots that go back to childhood, to formative experiences that shaped how we see ourselves and the world. Maybe you had a parent who was inconsistent, loving one moment and rejecting the next. If so, you might have developed what Jung would call an abandonment complex. And now, as an adult, you might find yourself repeatedly sabotaging relationships just as they're getting serious, unconsciously recreating the experience of abandonment, but this time with you in control of it. Or perhaps you grew up in an environment where expressing emotions was discouraged, where you learned that showing vulnerability led to punishment or ridicule. This could have created a complex around emotional expression, leading you to shut down emotionally in your adult relationships, pushing people away with your inability to be vulnerable, and then wondering why you always end up alone. The key insight here is that these patterns persist not because you're weak or damaged, but because there's an unconscious logic to them. The part of you that's creating the pattern is operating on old information, old programming that was once adaptive but is now limiting. It's like you're running software from your childhood on the hardware of your adult life, and it's causing constant glitches and crashes. But here's what makes this first sign so important to recognize. Once you become aware that you're repeating a pattern, once you can step back and see the script you've been unconsciously following, you've taken the first step toward changing it. Jung believed that consciousness itself has transformative power. As he famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The moment you can look at your pattern and say, "I see this, I recognize what I'm doing," you've begun the process of bringing the unconscious into consciousness. You've started to illuminate the shadow. So how do you recognize these patterns in your own life? Start by looking for situations where you feel a sense of déjà vu, where you think to yourself, "Why does this keep happening to me?" That feeling of repetition, of being stuck in a loop, is often your psyche's way of trying to get your attention, of showing you that there's something here that needs to be understood and integrated. Pay attention to the moments in your life where you feel most out of control, where you act in ways that seem to contradict your conscious intentions. These are often moments when a complex has been activated, when the unconscious has temporarily taken over. And most importantly, look for the common thread that connects seemingly different situations. Maybe at first glance, your failed relationships don't seem to have anything in common. Different people, different circumstances, different reasons why things ended. But if you look deeper, if you're willing to be honest with yourself, you might see that there's a pattern there, a role you play, a moment where you always pull back, a type of person you always choose, a dynamic that always develops. Jung's work teaches us that these patterns aren't evidence of our brokenness, they're actually roadmaps to our healing. Each repetition of a self-destructive pattern is an opportunity to become more conscious, to understand ourselves more deeply, and to finally integrate the parts of ourselves that we've been unconsciously acting out. The pattern will keep repeating, getting louder and more disruptive, until we finally pay attention to what it's trying to tell us. So if you recognize this first sign in your life, if you can see patterns repeating despite your best conscious efforts to change them, don't despair. This isn't a life sentence. It's an invitation to go deeper, to explore the unconscious forces that have been running your life without your permission, and to finally bring them into the light where they can be transformed. The second sign that you're engaged in self-sabotage is one of Jung's most famous discoveries: psychological projection. This is when traits that you reject in yourself become the very things you see, judge, and criticize most intensely in other people. And here's what makes this so insidious. You genuinely believe that what you're seeing is entirely about the other person, with no awareness that you're actually looking at a reflection of your own shadow. Jung described projection as a defensive mechanism, where the unconscious transfers its own unacceptable impulses, feelings, and thoughts onto another person. It's like your psyche has a high-powered spotlight, and instead of turning it inward to illuminate parts of yourself you don't want to see, it beams that light outward onto someone else. This allows you to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself, while simultaneously giving you a target for all the judgment and criticism that's really meant for the rejected parts of your own psyche. Let me paint you a picture of how this plays out in real life. Imagine someone, let's call him Michael, who prides himself on being honest and straightforward. He's the kind of person who will tell you exactly what he thinks, sometimes brutally so, and he justifies this by saying he values authenticity above all else. But here's what Michael doesn't realize. He has a massive blind spot. He's obsessively critical of people he perceives as manipulative. Whenever he encounters someone who seems to be using charm or social skills to get what they want, Michael becomes intensely reactive. He'll go on and on about how fake they are, how they're deceiving everyone around them, how people who operate that way can't be trusted. His friends have learned to just let him vent when he gets on this topic, because once he starts, he can talk for hours about the manipulative behavior he's witnessed. But what Michael can't see, what his shadow won't allow him to acknowledge, is that he himself is constantly manipulating situations and people, just in a different way. His brutal honesty isn't about authenticity. It's a sophisticated form of control. By positioning himself as the person who always tells the truth, no matter how harsh, he's created a persona that allows him to dominate conversations, shut down viewpoints he disagrees with, and make himself feel superior to others. His honesty is a weapon, a form of manipulation that he's completely blind to, because he's projected his own manipulative tendencies onto other people. This is the psychological function of projection. It allows us to maintain a positive self-image, what Jung called the persona, by externalizing the parts of ourselves that don't fit with how we want to see ourselves. The more vehemently we reject something in ourselves, the more powerfully we'll project it onto others. And the projection becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because once we've decided that someone embodies a trait we despise, we'll interpret everything they do through that lens, finding evidence for our projection even in neutral behaviors. Jung observed that projection is particularly strong when it comes to what he called the inferior function, the least developed part of our personality. If you're someone who lives primarily in your intellect, constantly analyzing and rationalizing everything, you might project onto emotional people, seeing them as weak or unstable. Meanwhile, you're completely unaware of your own suppressed emotions that occasionally erupt in ways that contradict your carefully constructed rational persona. If you're highly organized and disciplined, you might find yourself extremely critical of people you perceive as chaotic or spontaneous, never recognizing that your rigidity is a defense against the spontaneous, creative parts of yourself that you've pushed into the shadow. Here's a powerful way to identify projection in your own life. Pay attention to your emotional reactions to other people, particularly reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation. If someone does something that mildly annoys most people, but sends you into a rage, that's often a sign that you're not just reacting to their behavior, you're reacting to something in yourself that their behavior is triggering. Ask yourself this question: what bothers me most about other people? Make a list if you want. Maybe it's laziness, maybe it's dishonesty, maybe it's neediness, maybe it's arrogance. Whatever shows up on that list is probably a roadmap to your shadow. Those aren't just random pet peeves. They're signposts pointing to parts of yourself that you've rejected and projected onto others. Now here's where this gets even more interesting and complex. Jung discovered that projection isn't always negative. We don't just project our negative traits onto others. We also project positive qualities, capacities, and potentials that we possess, but haven't claimed for ourselves. This is what he called positive projection, and it's just as much a form of self-sabotage as negative projection, maybe even more so because it seems beneficial on the surface. Let me explain how this works. Imagine a woman named Lisa, who's incredibly talented but constantly downplays her abilities. Whenever she accomplishes something, she attributes it to luck, timing, or the help of others. She genuinely doesn't see her own competence. But here's what's fascinating. Lisa is constantly drawn to confident, successful people. She puts them on pedestals, admires them intensely, and often finds herself in relationships or friendships where she's in the supporting role to someone else's leadership. She'll work tirelessly to help others achieve their goals, while her own dreams remain perpetually on hold. What's happening here is that Lisa is projecting her own power, competence, and potential onto others. She can see those qualities clearly when they're embodied by someone else, but she's completely blind to them in herself. This is self-sabotage because by projecting her power onto others, Lisa never has to take responsibility for developing and expressing it herself. She never has to face the fear, the vulnerability, and the responsibility that would come with stepping into her own greatness. It's safer to admire those qualities in others than to claim them for herself. Jung called this the process of individuation that gets stalled. Instead of integrating all the parts of herself, including her power and competence, Lisa keeps those qualities at arm's length by seeing them only in other people. This kind of positive projection is rampant in our culture, and it's one of the primary ways we sabotage ourselves. We create heroes, gurus, and celebrities, projecting onto them all the qualities we possess but are afraid to embody. Then we consume their content, read their books, follow their advice, all while remaining in the position of student or follower rather than stepping into our own authority. I'm not saying we shouldn't learn from others or be inspired by people we admire, but when that admiration becomes a substitute for developing those same qualities in ourselves, when we use someone else's greatness as an excuse for our own smallness, we're engaged in projection-based self-sabotage. So how do you work with projection? How do you take back these disowned parts of yourself? Jung's method was what he called withdrawal of projections, and it's both simple and profoundly difficult. It starts with recognition. When you find yourself intensely focused on someone else's traits, whether you're criticizing them or idealizing them, pause and ask yourself, could this be about me? Is there any possibility that what I'm seeing in this person is actually a reflection of something in myself that I haven't acknowledged? This question needs to be asked with genuine curiosity, not with judgment or self-criticism. You're not trying to beat yourself up or prove that you're a bad person. You're simply exploring the possibility that your psyche is showing you something important through the mirror of another person. The next step is even harder. You have to allow yourself to see and feel the disowned part. If you've been projecting laziness onto others, you have to be willing to acknowledge the ways you avoid effort or cut corners. If you've been projecting power onto others, you have to be willing to feel your own strength and capability, even if that feels uncomfortable or scary. This process of withdrawing projections and reclaiming disowned parts of yourself is at the heart of what Jung called shadow work. It's how we become more whole, more conscious, and ultimately more free from the patterns that have been running our lives without our awareness. Here's the beautiful paradox. Once you start withdrawing your projections and owning these parts of yourself, something remarkable happens. The people who used to trigger you so intensely start to lose their power over you. You can see them more clearly as they actually are rather than as screens for your projections. Your relationships improve because you're no longer constantly reacting to ghosts of your own psyche. And most importantly, you gain access to all the energy you were spending on projection, whether it was energy spent criticizing others or energy spent idealizing them. That energy becomes available for your own growth and development. So if you recognize this second sign, if you can see patterns of projection in your life, you're actually in a position of great power. Every projection you identify and withdraw is a piece of yourself that you're reclaiming. Every time you catch yourself judging someone intensely or putting someone on a pedestal, you have an opportunity to ask, what is this showing me about myself? What part of me am I avoiding by focusing so intently on this other person? These questions, asked with honesty and courage, can transform your entire relationship with yourself and others. They can turn projection from an unconscious pattern of self-sabotage into a conscious tool for self-discovery and growth. The third sign of self-sabotage is one that most of us are intimately familiar with, yet rarely recognize for what it truly is: a relentlessly harsh inner critic. This is the voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you'll never succeed, that everyone else is better than you. It's the voice that magnifies your mistakes while minimizing your achievements, that catastrophizes every setback and dismisses every success. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Most people believe this voice is actually them, their true thoughts about themselves. But from a Jungian perspective, this cruel inner critic is actually a manifestation of shadow material, often a voice that was internalized from parents, teachers, or society during your formative years. Jung understood that we don't develop in isolation. We are shaped by the expectations, judgments, and values of the people around us, especially during childhood, when our psyches are most impressionable. When we fail to meet these external expectations, when we're criticized or punished for not living up to certain standards, we often internalize those judgmental voices. They become part of our internal landscape, a shadow figure that Jung sometimes referred to as the negative animus or anima, depending on context. This internalized critic serves a psychological function. It tries to keep you safe by preventing you from taking risks that might lead to the rejection or failure you experienced in the past. But the price of this safety is enormous. It keeps you playing small, second-guessing yourself and perpetually feeling inadequate. Let me tell you about someone named David. David is a talented graphic designer who dreams of starting his own agency. He has the skills, the vision, and even some potential clients who've expressed interest. But every time he gets close to taking the leap, his inner critic goes into overdrive. Who do you think you are to start your own business? You're not talented enough. Look at all the successful designers out there. You'll never compete with them. Remember that project that didn't go well 3 years ago? That's proof you can't do this. What if you fail? What if everyone sees you're a fraud? The voice is so loud, so convincing, so detailed in its criticism that David feels paralyzed. He stays in his safe but unfulfilling job, his dreams perpetually on hold, convinced that his inner critic is just being realistic, just protecting him from inevitable failure. But here's what David doesn't realize. This isn't his authentic voice of wisdom or discernment. This is the voice of his father, a perfectionist who could never acknowledge David's accomplishments without immediately pointing out what could have been better. As a child, David learned that nothing he did was ever quite good enough. His psyche, trying to adapt to this impossible standard, internalized his father's critical voice. The logic was simple. If I criticize myself first, if I find every flaw before anyone else does, maybe I can finally achieve the perfection that will earn love and approval. But perfection is impossible, which means the criticism never stops. The internalized father figure has become a shadow tyrant, ruling David's psyche with an iron fist, ensuring that he never takes risks that might expose him to the rejection he fears most. Jung observed that the intensity of the inner critic is often proportional to the gap between the persona we present to the world and the authentic self we've repressed. The more we try to be someone we're not, the more energy we spend maintaining a false image, the harsher our inner critic becomes. It's as if some part of us knows we're living a lie and punishes us for it. The critic says, "You're a fraud, you're not who you pretend to be," and we interpret this as evidence of our inadequacy. But actually, it's pointing to a truth: we're not being authentic. The solution isn't to try harder to be the idealized version of ourselves, but to acknowledge and integrate the parts we've been rejecting. There's also a paradoxical relationship between the inner critic and what Jung called ego inflation. Sometimes the harshest inner critics belong to people who secretly harbor grandiose fantasies about themselves. There's a part of them that believes they should be exceptional, perfect, the best at everything they do. And since reality can never match this inflated self-image, another part of the psyche, residing in the shadow, attacks them viciously for falling short. The criticism is actually proportional to the unrealistic expectations. It's the psyche's way of trying to create balance, to humble the inflated ego. But instead of leading to genuine humility and self-acceptance, this dynamic creates a torturous cycle where the person swings between grandiosity and self-hatred, never finding the middle ground of authentic self-worth. So how do you recognize whether your inner voice is genuine discernment or shadow-driven self-sabotage? Here are some key differences. Genuine inner wisdom is firm but kind, specific but not global, and motivating rather than paralyzing. It might say, "That approach didn't work, what can you learn from this?" or "You need to develop your skills in this area." The shadow critic, on the other hand, is cruel, uses absolute language like always and never, and makes global attacks on your worth as a person. It says things like, "You always mess everything up. You'll never succeed. You're fundamentally flawed." Genuine wisdom points toward growth. The shadow critic keeps you stuck in shame. Another telltale sign of the shadow critic is that it's never satisfied. You can achieve something remarkable, and within moments, it's dismissing that achievement and pointing to the next way you're falling short. This is because the critic isn't actually about your performance or achievements. It's about maintaining the psychological pattern that was established long ago. If it allowed you to feel genuinely good about yourself, The old belief system that you need to be perfect to be worthy would collapse, and the shadow prefers familiar suffering to unknown freedom. Working with the inner critic from a Jungian perspective isn't about positive affirmations or trying to silence the voice. Those approaches rarely work because they don't address the underlying shadow material. Instead, Jung would encourage you to personify the critic, to externalize it so you can see it more clearly. Give it a form, maybe imagine it as a character or figure. Then dialogue with it. Ask it, what are you trying to protect me from? What do you fear would happen if you stopped criticizing me? When did you first appear in my life? What would you need in order to relax your grip? This process of active imagination allows you to relate to the critic as a part of your psyche that has its own history and purpose, rather than identifying with it as your true self. You might discover that beneath the harsh criticism is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as inadequate. And beneath that fear is often pain, the pain of a child who wasn't good enough for the love they needed, who learned that their worth was conditional on performance. The critic developed as a defense against ever feeling that pain again. But defenses that develop in childhood often become prisons in adulthood. The work is to acknowledge that pain, to understand where the critic came from, and to gradually develop a new internal voice, one that can provide genuine guidance and support rather than constant attacks. Jung believed that as we integrate our shadow, as we reclaim the parts of ourselves we've rejected, the power of negative internal voices diminishes naturally. This is because the critic is often attacking the very qualities we've pushed into the shadow. If you've repressed your anger, your critic might attack you for being too passive. If you've hidden your vulnerability, your critic might attack you for being too weak. If you've rejected your ambition, your critic might attack you for not being successful enough. The critic is paradoxically pointing toward what needs to be integrated, even as it makes the integration more difficult through its harsh methods. One powerful practice is to pay attention to when your inner critic is loudest. Often it activates most intensely right before you're about to do something meaningful, something that would represent genuine growth or authenticity. You're about to have a difficult conversation, and suddenly the critic tells you you'll mess it up. You're about to share your creative work, and the critic tells you it's not good enough. You're about to assert a boundary, and the critic tells you you're being selfish. These moments are actually opportunities. The critic's intensity reveals that you're touching something important, something that threatens the old pattern. If you can recognize this and move forward anyway, you begin to prove to your psyche that growth is possible, that you can survive disappointing others or being imperfect. And gradually the critic loses its power. So if you recognize this third sign, if you can feel the presence of a harsh inner critic that constantly sabotages your confidence and keeps you playing small, know that you're not broken. You're carrying a defense mechanism that once tried to protect you, but now needs to be transformed. Through understanding its origins, dialoguing with it, and gradually taking action despite its objections, you can develop a new relationship with yourself, one based on compassion and authentic self-worth, rather than criticism and conditional acceptance. The fourth sign of self-sabotage is one that seems paradoxical at first, but makes perfect sense through a Jungian lens. You fear success as much as, or even more than, failure. Most people recognize when they're afraid of failure. It's obvious why you might avoid taking risks if you're worried about falling short, being judged, or experiencing disappointment. But what Jung discovered is that success itself can be terrifying, and this fear often operates entirely in the unconscious, sabotaging our efforts without us ever realizing what's really happening. Why would anyone fear success? From a Jungian perspective, success represents a profound psychological challenge. It means stepping into a larger version of yourself, claiming power and visibility you've been avoiding, and fundamentally changing your identity. And here's the key. Every identity, even a limiting one, provides a sense of security and coherence. We know who we are within our current identity, even if we don't like it. Success threatens that known self and pushes us toward an unknown future self. Jung observed that the psyche naturally resists rapid change, even positive change, because change represents a kind of death to the current self. This is what he meant when he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Let me tell you about a woman named Jennifer. Jennifer is brilliant, truly exceptional at what she does. She's a software engineer with innovative ideas that could revolutionize her field. But here's what's strange. Every time Jennifer gets close to a major breakthrough, every time one of her projects is about to bring her significant recognition, something goes wrong. She might suddenly develop health issues that force her to step back. She might have a conflict with a colleague that derails the project. She might make an uncharacteristic error that undermines her credibility. From the outside, it looks like bad luck. But after this pattern repeats 5, 6, 7 times, it becomes clear that something else is happening. When Jennifer finally explores this pattern in therapy, what emerges is fascinating and heartbreaking. Jennifer grew up in a family where she was constantly told, both explicitly and implicitly, not to outshine her mother. Her mother was a talented woman who'd given up her own career aspirations to raise children and had significant resentment about this sacrifice. Whenever Jennifer showed signs of ambition or achievement, her mother would become cold and withdrawn, or make subtle comments that deflated Jennifer's excitement. The message was clear: your success makes me feel bad about myself, so if you want my love, you need to stay small. As a child, Jennifer couldn't consciously process this impossible bind. She just knew at a visceral level that success meant losing her mother's love. So she developed a deep unconscious association. Achievement equals abandonment. Now, as an adult, Jennifer consciously wants success. She works hard, she's talented, she does everything right. But deep in her shadow, there's a terrified child who believes that if she becomes too successful, she'll be all alone. Every time she approaches a major achievement, this part of her psyche activates, pulling the emergency brake. It's not that Jennifer is weak or self-destructive by nature. It's that she's carrying an unresolved complex from childhood that's running her life from the unconscious. Until she can bring this into consciousness, until she can understand and work through her unconscious equation of success with abandonment, the pattern will continue. Jung identified what he called the fear of one's own greatness, what some modern psychologists call the Jonah complex, after the biblical figure who ran from his calling. This is the fear of claiming your full potential, of becoming who you're truly capable of being, and it's far more common than most people realize. Jung observed that we're often more afraid of our light than our darkness, more terrified of our power than our weakness. Why? Because power means responsibility. It means you can no longer blame circumstances or other people for your life. It means you have to act, to choose, to potentially fail in ways that matter. Staying small, staying stuck, provides a certain comfort. You never have to find out what you're truly capable of, which means you never have to face the possibility of trying your best and still falling short. There's also what Jung called ego inflation to consider. Sometimes people unconsciously sabotage success because some part of them has grandiose fantasies about what success means. They imagine that if they achieve their goals, they'll become perfect, completely happy beyond all human limitation. And since that's impossible, the psyche creates obstacles to prevent the ego from inflating to dangerous proportions. The self-sabotage is actually a regulatory mechanism, keeping the person grounded in reality rather than flying too close to the sun. But instead of leading to healthy humility, this dynamic keeps the person stuck, unable to achieve anything significant because they can't do so without triggering the unconscious fear of inflation. Another aspect of success fear involves what Jung called the shadow's golden qualities. Sometimes the shadow contains not just negative traits we've rejected, but positive qualities we've never claimed. Maybe you've disowned your power, your brilliance, your leadership capacity, because these qualities were discouraged in your family or culture. Success would require you to finally claim these qualities, to integrate them into your conscious identity. But that integration is terrifying because it means acknowledging that you've been living far below your potential, that you've wasted years in patterns that weren't necessary. It's often easier to continue the familiar pattern of limitation than to face the grief and responsibility that come with claiming your full capacity. There's also the phenomenon Jung observed of what happens when you achieve something you've been striving for. Sometimes the moment of achievement reveals that it wasn't the achievement itself you wanted, but what you imagined it would provide. Love, worth, validation, a sense of being enough. When success comes but doesn't fill the existential void, when you achieve the goal but still feel empty, it can be devastating. Many people unconsciously sense this potential disappointment and sabotage themselves before they have to face it. Better to believe I could be happy if only I achieved X than to achieve X and discover that you're still fundamentally the same person with the same struggles. How do you recognize fear of success as opposed to fear of failure? Look for these patterns. You work incredibly hard up to a certain point, then suddenly lose motivation right before you'd break through. You have opportunities come to you, but find reasons not to take them. You achieve something but immediately minimize it or find something wrong with it. You notice that good things happening make you anxious rather than joyful. You find yourself thinking, "This is too good to be true," or "I don't deserve this" when things go well. These are all signs that your shadow is sabotaging success, because success itself represents a threat to your current identity or triggers unconscious fears and complexes. Working with fear of success requires excavating the unconscious beliefs and complexes that make achievement feel dangerous. What did you learn about success growing up? What happened to people in your family or community who achieved recognition? What would it mean about you if you actually fulfilled your potential? What would you have to give up or let go of? What relationships might change? These questions can reveal the hidden costs your psyche associates with success, the unconscious calculations that lead to self-sabotage. Jung also emphasized the importance of gradually expanding your capacity to hold success, to integrate it into your identity without inflation or collapse. This means celebrating small achievements, allowing yourself to feel pride without immediately deflating it or moving on to the next goal. It means developing what he called a relationship to the self, capital S, the deeper organizing center of the psyche that's larger than the ego. From this perspective, your achievements aren't about ego aggrandizement, but about fulfilling your unique purpose and potential. Success becomes not about proving your worth or outshining others, but about expressing the self that's trying to emerge through you. So if you recognize this fourth sign, if you can see patterns where you sabotage yourself right at the threshold of success, approach this with compassion and curiosity. Your psyche isn't broken. It's protecting you from something it perceives as dangerous. The work is to discover what that danger is, to bring it into consciousness, and to gradually prove to yourself that you can handle success. That achievement doesn't have to mean abandonment, inflation, or disappointment. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that requires having the courage to succeed, to claim your greatness, even when every unconscious pattern is pulling you back toward familiar limitation. The fifth sign that you're engaged in self-sabotage is perhaps the most visible yet least understood: compulsive behaviors. These are the things you do repeatedly despite knowing they're harmful, despite genuinely wanting to stop, despite the negative consequences piling up. It might be compulsive eating, drinking, spending, working, scrolling through social media, watching pornography, gaming, or any number of other behaviors that provide temporary relief but long-term harm. From a Jungian perspective, these compulsions aren't just bad habits or lack of willpower. They're the shadow's way of expressing needs and feelings that have been rejected by the conscious mind. Jung understood that compulsive behaviors are compensatory. When we repress certain aspects of ourselves, when we deny certain needs or feelings, they don't disappear. Instead, they find expression through the back door, through behaviors that often directly contradict our conscious values and intentions. The perfectionist who compulsively overeats isn't just lacking discipline around food. They're trying to satisfy hungers that have nothing to do with physical nutrition. The hunger for comfort, for pleasure, for something they're allowed to consume without judgment. The workaholic who can't stop checking email isn't just dedicated to their career. They're avoiding feelings of worthlessness or emptiness that emerge whenever they stop performing and achieving. Let me tell you about a man named Robert. Robert is health-conscious, successful, has everything together on the surface, but he has a secret that fills him with shame. Every night after his family goes to bed, he raids the kitchen and eats compulsively until he feels sick. He's tried every diet, every strategy, read every book about willpower and habit change. Nothing works. The compulsion always returns, and with it, waves of self-hatred and confusion. Why do I keep doing this to myself? He asks. I know it's not about the food, but I can't seem to stop. When Robert begins to explore this from a Jungian perspective, a pattern emerges. Robert grew up in a household where emotions were strictly controlled. His parents believed that the path to success was discipline, rationality, suppressing feelings that might interfere with achievement. Robert learned this lesson well. He became excellent at controlling his emotions, at pushing down feelings of sadness, fear, or anger, at presenting a calm, rational facade to the world. But those emotions didn't actually go away. They went into the shadow where they've been accumulating for decades. The compulsive eating is their voice. Food is one of the few places where Robert allows himself to be out of control, to feel something, even if that something is shame and physical discomfort. The compulsion is paradoxically both an expression of the repressed feelings and a way to avoid really feeling them. He eats to feel something, but the eating itself numbs him to the deeper emotional hunger that's actually driving the behavior. This is the key insight about compulsions from a Jungian view. They're symbolic. The behavior itself is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. The person who compulsively shops isn't really seeking more stuff. They're trying to fill an internal emptiness. The person who works compulsively isn't really passionate about their job. They're running from parts of themselves they'd encounter in stillness. The person who compulsively seeks sexual encounters isn't really seeking sex. They're seeking validation, connection, or a sense of aliveness they can't find elsewhere. Jung would say that compulsive behaviors are the shadow's attempt to meet legitimate needs through illegitimate means. There's also what Jung called the problem of addiction, which he saw as fundamentally spiritual in nature. He famously corresponded with Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, about this. Jung believed that addiction fills the place where authentic connection to the self should be. The compulsion for alcohol, drugs, or any other behavior is actually a misdirected spiritual hunger, a yearning for transcendence, wholeness, and meaning that's being sought through substances or behaviors that can never actually provide it. This is why purely behavioral or cognitive approaches to compulsion often fail. They address the symptom without addressing the underlying spiritual and psychological emptiness that's driving it. Jung also recognized what modern psychology calls the addiction cycle, the building tension, the compulsive behavior, the temporary relief, and then the shame and self-hatred that create more tension, starting the cycle again. From his perspective, this cycle is maintained by the split between conscious and unconscious. Your conscious mind judges and rejects the compulsive part of you, which only makes it more powerful and desperate. The more you hate the compulsion, the more shadow power it gains. The more you try to control it through willpower alone, the more it resists. Jung observed that what we resist persists, and nowhere is this more apparent than with compulsive behaviors. There's another layer to this that's crucial to understand. Sometimes compulsive behaviors serve a protective function. They prevent you from feeling things that your psyche has determined you can't handle, from making changes that feel too threatening, from being present with parts of yourself that are too painful. The compulsion becomes a prison, but it's a familiar prison, and there's safety in that familiarity. The person who uses work compulsively avoids dealing with a failing marriage. The person who drinks compulsively avoids confronting childhood trauma. The person who games compulsively avoids facing their lack of direction in life. The compulsion is both the problem and the solution, or at least it feels like a solution to the unconscious mind. How do you work with compulsive behaviors from a Jungian perspective? The first step is to stop making the compulsion your enemy. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but as long as you're at war with the compulsive part of yourself, you're maintaining the split that feeds it. Instead, Jung would encourage you to approach the compulsion with curiosity. What is it trying to give you? What need is it attempting to meet? If it could speak, what would it say? This requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, acknowledging that you want to stop the behavior, while also understanding that some part of you desperately needs it. Active imagination can be powerful here. Imagine the compulsion as a figure or entity. Maybe it's a rebellious teenager, a wounded child, a shadow creature. Dialogue with it. Ask it what it wants, what it's afraid of, what it would need in order to relax its grip. Often what emerges is that the compulsion is trying to protect you or meet a legitimate need in the only way it knows how. The compulsive eating is trying to comfort you. The compulsive work is trying to give you a sense of worth. The compulsive substance use is trying to help you manage overwhelming emotions. Once you understand the compulsion's positive intention, even as you recognize its harmful methods, you can begin to find healthier ways to meet those underlying needs. Jung also emphasized the importance of shadow work in addressing compulsions. Often, the behavior is directly related to qualities or aspects of yourself that you've rejected. If you've rejected your need for pleasure, sensuality might show up compulsively through food, sex, or substances. If you've rejected your need for rest, You might compulsively keep yourself busy to avoid the guilt of slowing down. If you've rejected your anger, it might show up as self-destructive behaviors that harm you. By reclaiming these rejected parts, by finding appropriate expression for the underlying needs, the compulsion loses its power. There's also the spiritual dimension Jung emphasized. Compulsive behaviors often point to a lack of meaning, purpose, or connection to something larger than yourself. Working with the compulsion might require not just psychological work, but spiritual exploration. What gives your life meaning? Where do you find authentic transcendence and connection? What would it mean to fill the void the compulsion is trying to fill with something real rather than something hollow? These aren't easy questions, but they're often essential for truly transforming compulsive patterns. So if you recognize this fifth sign, if you're struggling with behaviors you can't seem to stop despite their negative consequences, know that you're not weak or fundamentally flawed. You're experiencing the shadow's attempt to meet real needs through problematic means. The work isn't to attack the compulsion but to understand it, to discover what it's protecting you from or trying to give you, and to gradually find ways to meet those underlying needs directly. This is a process often requiring patience and support, but it's absolutely possible. As Jung said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That includes choosing to understand and integrate even the most shameful parts of yourself. The sixth sign of self-sabotage is one that's particularly difficult to recognize in ourselves. Yet Jung considered it one of the most common ways we avoid individuation, playing the victim role. This doesn't mean that you haven't experienced genuine hardship or that your pain isn't real. What it means is that you've organized your identity around being powerless, around having things happen to you, rather than making choices that shape your reality. From a Jungian perspective, the victim is an archetype, a universal pattern that exists in the collective unconscious. And like all archetypes, it can possess us, becoming the lens through which we see everything. When you're possessed by the victim archetype, life is constantly happening to you. Other people are always disappointing you. Circumstances are always working against you, and you have a story ready to explain why you couldn't possibly succeed or be happy given everything you've been through. And here's the crucial part. These stories are often based on real events. You may have genuinely been victimized, genuinely faced unfair circumstances, genuinely experienced hardship. But the question Jung would ask is, are you still living from that experience, or have you made it your identity? Let me tell you about a woman named Maria. Maria had a difficult childhood. Her father left when she was young, her mother struggled with depression, and Maria often had to take care of herself and her siblings. These are real hardships that left real scars. But now, 30 years later, Maria is still telling the story of her childhood as the explanation for everything in her life. She's not in a relationship because her father abandoned her, and she can't trust men. She's not advancing in her career because she didn't have the advantages other people had. She's not close to her siblings because they don't appreciate everything she sacrificed for them. Every time something goes wrong, Maria has a ready explanation that places her as the victim of forces beyond her control. What Maria can't see is that this victim identity, which initially developed as a way to make sense of childhood trauma, has become a prison. By organizing her identity around being powerless, she's unconsciously creating situations that confirm this belief. She chooses partners who aren't fully available, then feels victimized when they don't commit. She doesn't pursue promotions or new opportunities, then feels victimized when others advance past her. She maintains distance from her siblings, then feels victimized by their lack of closeness. The victim role has become a form of self-sabotage because it relieves her of the terrifying responsibility of taking agency in her life. Jung understood that the victim role serves important psychological functions. First, it protects the ego from having to acknowledge its own power and therefore its own responsibility. If you're powerless, if things are always being done to you, then you can't be blamed when your life doesn't work out. You don't have to face the frightening truth that your choices matter, that you have agency, that you could change things, but haven't. Second, the victim role often elicits a specific kind of attention and care from others. People feel sorry for you, try to help you, treat you gently. This can feel like a form of love, especially for people who never received unconditional love and don't believe they deserve it just for existing. Being a victim becomes a strategy for getting needs met. There's also what Jung called the secondary gain of symptoms. The victim role, like any psychological pattern, wouldn't persist if it didn't provide some benefit. For some people, being a victim provides a sense of moral superiority. I'm the good one who was wronged, and they're the bad ones who wronged me. This simple binary feels satisfying, even if it's inaccurate. For others, the victim role provides a sense of identity and coherence. Who would you be if you weren't the person these terrible things happened to? If you let go of the victim story, you'd have to construct a new identity, and that's frightening. Better to stick with the familiar narrative, even if it keeps you stuck. Jung also observed that the victim role is often paired with its opposite in the shadow, the perpetrator. People who identify strongly as victims often have unacknowledged aggressive, controlling, or manipulative tendencies that they've pushed into their shadow. The victim identity allows them to feel entirely innocent while unconsciously acting out in ways that harm others. Maria, for instance, doesn't see how her constant victim narrative manipulates people into taking care of her, how her refusal to take responsibility impacts those around her, how her bitter stories about her siblings are themselves a form of harm. These perpetrator qualities are in her shadow, where they operate without her awareness, even as she maintains a conscious identity as someone who's only ever been harmed, never harmful. The relationship between victimhood and self-sabotage is profound. When you're identified with being powerless, you can't take the actions necessary for change. Every opportunity becomes another setup for disappointment. Every relationship becomes another chance to be hurt. Every goal becomes impossible given your circumstances. The victim identity creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where you unconsciously ensure that things don't work out, which then confirms your belief that you're powerless. It's a closed loop that feels like fate, but is actually a choice, albeit an unconscious one. How do you recognize when you're playing the victim role? Notice your internal narrative. Are you the subject or object of your own life story? Do you use active or passive language when describing your situation? Compare. I decided not to pursue that opportunity because I was afraid. 2. That opportunity didn't work out for me. The first takes ownership. The second positions you as passive. Pay attention to how you feel when good things happen. If success or happiness makes you uncomfortable or anxious, it might be because they contradict your victim identity. Notice whether you have a story ready for every setback, a story that places blame outside yourself. Ask yourself honestly, what would I have to give up or confront if I weren't a victim? What does this role protect me from? Working with the victim archetype from a Jungian perspective requires what he called conscious suffering. This means allowing yourself to feel the full weight of your situation without the relief of blame, without the escape of the victim narrative. It means sitting with the terrifying truth that you have power and agency, which means you also have responsibility. It's often much harder than it sounds, because responsibility feels overwhelming when you've organized your identity around powerlessness. But Jung believed this was essential for individuation, for becoming who you truly are, rather than remaining possessed by an archetype. One powerful practice is to rewrite your story with yourself as the protagonist rather than the victim. This doesn't mean denying what happened to you or pretending trauma doesn't exist. It means shifting the focus from what was done to you to how you responded, what you survived, what you learned, what you're choosing now. Instead of, my father abandoned me and now I can't trust anyone, try, my father left, which was incredibly painful, and I developed protective mechanisms that served me then but limit me now, and I'm choosing to work on trust. Do you feel the difference? One keeps you stuck in the past, the other acknowledges the past while claiming agency in the present. Jung also emphasized the importance of withdrawing projections related to victimhood. Often, victims are constantly looking for perpetrators, seeing threats and ill intentions everywhere. This keeps you in a state of defensiveness and reactivity. By withdrawing these projections, by recognizing that not everyone is out to hurt you, that many situations are neutral rather than attacking, you can begin to relax the vigilance that keeps you trapped in the victim role. So if you recognize this sixth sign, if you can see patterns of victim thinking and behavior in your life, approach this with both honesty and compassion. Yes, you need to take responsibility for your choices and their consequences, but you also need to acknowledge the real hardships you faced and the real pain you carry. The goal isn't to swing from victim to self-blame, but to find a middle path where you honor what you've experienced while claiming your power to shape what comes next. As Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." The seventh and final sign of self-sabotage might be the most fundamental of all. You resist your own authenticity. This is when you build your life around who you think you should be, or who others want you to be rather than who you actually are. You maintain what Jung called the persona, the mask you show to the world, but that mask has become so rigid, so disconnected from your authentic self, that you're essentially living someone else's life. And the most tragic part is that you might not even realize you're doing it until a crisis forces the question, who am I really beneath all these roles and expectations? Jung distinguished between the persona, which is necessary and healthy when flexible, and persona identification, which is pathological. We all need a persona. It's how we navigate social situations, meet role expectations, and present ourselves appropriately in different contexts. You have a work persona, a family persona, a social persona. This is normal and adaptive. The problem arises when the persona becomes rigid and disconnected from the authentic self beneath it. When you're so identified with the role you're playing that you've lost touch with who you actually are. When the mask you're wearing has become glued to your face. Let me tell you about a man named Thomas. Thomas is a successful attorney, a devoted father, a respected community member. From the outside, his life looks perfect. But Thomas has a secret that even he barely acknowledges. He's profoundly unhappy. He feels like he's going through the motions, playing a role, but there's no authentic him in any of it. When did this happen? How did he end up here? As Thomas explores these questions in therapy, a story emerges. Thomas never wanted to be an attorney. As a young man, he was passionate about music. He played guitar, wrote songs, dreamed of a creative life. But his father was a practical man who made it clear that art was a hobby, not a career. His family needed him to be responsible, successful, financially secure. So Thomas put away his guitar, went to law school, built the life his family wanted for him. At first it was a conscious choice, but over time he forgot it was a choice. The attorney persona consumed him entirely. The musical, creative, passionate part of him went into the shadow, where it's been slowly dying for 20 years. Now at 45, Thomas is having what he calls a midlife crisis, but what Jung would recognize as a call from the self. His psyche is rebelling against the rigid persona, demanding authenticity even if the conscious mind resists. Thomas finds himself uncharacteristically angry, restless, drawn to behaviors that don't fit his responsible persona. He's not having an affair or buying a sports car, the cliché midlife crisis behaviors, but he is experiencing what Jung called the midlife transition, the point where the psyche demands integration of what's been left behind. This is one of Jung's most important insights. The psyche has its own agenda, its own direction, its own wisdom. He called this the process of individuation, the drive toward wholeness, toward becoming fully yourself rather than a collection of roles and expectations. And the psyche will not be denied forever. If you ignore its call to authenticity, if you keep suppressing your true nature in service of the persona, it will eventually create symptoms, crises, disruptions designed to get your attention. Thomas's restlessness, his anger, his sense of emptiness, these aren't problems to be solved or symptoms to be medicated away. They're communications from his self, telling him that he's veered too far from his authentic path. Jung observed that resistance to authenticity takes many forms. Sometimes it's staying in a career that looks good, but feels dead. Sometimes it's maintaining relationships that meet social expectations, but lack genuine connection. Sometimes it's suppressing your true personality, your real interests, your authentic desires, because they don't fit the image you've created. Sometimes it's refusing to acknowledge your sexuality, your spirituality, your politics, or other core aspects of yourself because they conflict with your family's or community's expectations. In every case, you're choosing the false security of social acceptance over the genuine fulfillment of authentic living. There's a particular kind of self-sabotage that comes from this resistance to authenticity. You might unconsciously create crises that force you to confront what you're avoiding, an illness that forces you to slow down and reassess, a job loss that pushes you to consider what you actually want, a relationship ending that creates space for reflection. From a Jungian perspective, these aren't just random hardships. They're often the self's way of disrupting a life that's veered too far from authenticity. The self-sabotage is paradoxically in service of a larger healing, even though it doesn't feel that way in the moment. Jung also talked about what he called the second half of life, roughly from midlife onward, as the time when individuation becomes most urgent. In the first half of life, it's appropriate to focus on building the ego, establishing yourself in the world, meeting social expectations. But the second half of life calls for something different, deepening, integrating, becoming more fully yourself rather than more successful at being who others want you to be. People who resist this transition, who try to keep living according to first half of life values, often experience profound dissatisfaction and increasingly desperate forms of self-sabotage as the psyche tries to redirect them. How do you recognize when you're resisting authenticity? Ask yourself, if no one could see me or judge me, what would I do differently? Whose life am I living? When do I feel most like myself, and when do I feel like I'm performing? What parts of myself do I hide or suppress? What would I pursue if I knew I couldn't fail and no one would disapprove? The answers to these questions reveal the gap between your persona and your authentic self. And the wider that gap, the more self-sabotage you're likely experiencing as your psyche attempts to close it. Working with this requires what Jung called moral courage. The courage to be yourself even when it disappoints others, even when it means letting go of security, even when it's frightening. This doesn't mean being reckless or irresponsible. It means making conscious choices about how to integrate authenticity into your life, rather than letting the unconscious create crises that force the issue. For Thomas, this might mean finding ways to bring music back into his life, even if he doesn't quit his job to become a professional musician. It might mean acknowledging and honoring the creative part of himself that he's been starving. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human development is individuation, becoming fully yourself, integrating all the parts you've split off, living from your authentic center rather than from roles and expectations. Every act of self-sabotage that comes from resisting authenticity is actually your psyche's attempt to push you toward this goal. The question is, will you consciously engage with this process, or will you keep resisting until the psyche creates increasingly severe disruptions? As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. So here we are at the end of this exploration, having examined 7 signs that you're engaged in self-sabotage from a Jungian perspective. You repeat self-destructive patterns. You project your flaws onto others. Your inner critic is relentlessly harsh. You fear success as much as failure. You engage in compulsive behaviors. You play the victim role, and you resist your own authenticity. If you've recognized yourself in any of these signs, or especially if you've seen yourself in multiple ones, don't despair. Recognition is the first and most important step. Remember Jung's fundamental insight. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Everything we've discussed today is about bringing what's hidden into the light. Your self-sabotage isn't evidence that you're broken or hopeless. It's evidence that you have parts of yourself that need attention, integration, and healing. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's actually carrying the keys to your wholeness. Every pattern of self-sabotage points towards something that needs to be understood and integrated. The path forward begins with awareness, with honestly looking at these patterns without judgment. Then comes the deeper work of understanding where they came from, what they're protecting you from, what needs they're trying to meet. And finally comes integration, finding conscious, healthy ways to honor all parts of yourself, rather than keeping some in exile while they sabotage from the shadows. This is Jung's process of individuation, of becoming whole. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's the most important work you can do because your life is waiting for you. The authentic, whole, powerful version of yourself is waiting to emerge from the shadows, and the journey toward that self begins now.